Welcome to Module 2, Exercise 4. First, you will notice that I've already downloaded my picture of a wall that I'm going to be using. I've also transferred my sketch to my computer, but the first thing that I want to do is open the picture of the wall in Photoshop. So we're going to jump right in. First thing I did was unlock the layer, and I want to retitle it. I'm going to say wall. Now, in the last exercise, you learned about changing a photograph using curves, levels, and other adjustments. What you're going to do in this exercise is also treat the photograph with those adjustments, but do it in a very particular way. In your layers panel, if you go to the bottom, you'll see this half circle shape. That will give you a new fill or adjustment layer. Click on it and you are able to select an adjustment that you want to use. I want to change this original layer with levels. It will now give me the normal levels panel, which I'm familiar with using, and I can change my highlights, midtones, and shadows as I please. The benefit of using an adjustment layer as opposed to adjusting a pre-existent layer is that the information is not what we call lossy, L-O-S-S-Y. In other words, on my wall layer, everything looks exactly the same, but the adjustments are contained in a different layer. So any information that I want to change, if I wanted to go back and change my levels a little bit, I could do it within this levels layer and not worry about losing any of the original data to the photograph. This is what's called a best practice when using Photoshop. Photoshop is really unique in that it does use layers, and we want to use these layers to the best of our ability that will keep our workflow as efficient as possible and keep our data as lossless as possible. By adding these levels, you've already completed one of your steps for the exercise, which is to have an adjustment layer. I'm going to name this layer levels and just take the one off. Okay, I've designed my mural using a sketch, and I want to input that sketch into this file. To do so, I'm going to hit File and Place Embedded. I'm going to click the sketch from my desktop and hit Place. Now you'll notice that it automatically creates it in a new layer. It also has these black boxes around it. That's there so that I can transform the sketch to fit into any space that I want. And I'm going to go ahead and scale it up so that it more closely fits this wall space that I'm going to be creating in. It doesn't have to be perfect because I can go back in and readjust it later. When you're done adjusting it, click Enter. Now let me tell you about this layer that we just created. If you go down into your layers panel, you will notice there is a little icon on that sketch layer. The type of layer that it has created is called a Smart Object layer. You can view your particular types of layer. You can view your particular types of layers right here next to the drop-down menu in your layers panel. This is mainly for very large projects, if you wanted to see all of your text layers at once, for example. The main kind of layer is your pixel layer. This is for rasterized imagery, which I'll explain in a second. There are also your adjustment layers, type or text layers, shape layers, and smart object layers. You can identify that this is a smart object layer because our sketch layer shares the same type of icon. Now, what is the difference between a smart object layer, a pixel layer, and a shape layer? The image in the background of our wall is a pixel layer, meaning that it has been rasterized. Now, Basically, a pixel layer is made up of pixels. If I were to scroll in really closely, I would eventually see a grid. In each little box of this grid is a solid color, and those are pixels. The same thing is true if I were to scroll up and see my smart object layer. However, the way that Photoshop treats these two different layers is very different. So the pixel layer, the rasterized layer of the wall, if I were to shrink that down and then try to transform it back up, it would look more blurry than it did originally. That's because pixel or raster layers are lossy, L-O-S-S-Y, again, lossy, meaning that they lose information if you tell Photoshop that it can get rid of it. And by scaling something down, it's getting rid of some of those pixels because it doesn't need that many pixels in order to show the image at a smaller scale. The benefit, by comparison, of having a smart object layer is that it's working with Photoshop to basically treat the layer with some mathematics and equations so that it's not as lossy as a pixel layer. So if I were to scale this sketch down and then scale it back up, it would look exactly the same. You might think, why not always use a smart object layer in that case if it's not lossy? Well, smart object layers do have their drawbacks. For example, if I wanted to paint directly onto this layer, I would hit the paintbrush and then I would immediately see a no access signal, meaning that you can't paint on a smart object layer. It has to be rasterized first. And Photoshop will prompt me with that message if I try to click. The smart object must be rasterized before proceeding. Now, rasterizing a smart object layer will enable you to paint on it, but it immediately becomes a lossy layer. So, pros and cons. I don't want to rasterize it, so I'm not going to. Now, another type of layer is the shape layer. Okay, now shape layers are basically solely using vectors. So if I wanted to add a shape, I could just create a new layer and then start drawing my shapes on. Now, shapes are solely using vectors, as I said, so you can scale them up or down and they won't lose any information whatsoever. The benefit of a shape layer, because it's only using vectors, is that I could create an 8.5 by 11 document, let's say, and then scale it up to the size of a billboard, and it would still look exactly the same. That's because the mathematics involved in shape layers is very precise. The equations that the program is using are able to scale it up infinitely without any data being lost. Now, compared to a smart object layer, even though we can scale a smart object down and then scale it back up to size without it losing information, I can't take a smart object layer on a document this size and then scale it up to a billboard size and expect it to be clear. It simply won't be, because it's come in to the program with some pixel information, and then it's using the mathematics and the formulas to your advantage, but it's not perfecting that layer. Whereas when you're creating with these very graphic shapes, you're telling it ahead of time, only produce yourself in vectors. So it's never going to be pixels and it's never going to be lossy. So those are the main three types of layers in Photoshop and what you need to know about them. There are, of course, also type or text layers and adjustment layers. Adjustment layers we've already talked about and why that's important. Type or text layers I strongly discourage in Photoshop. InDesign is the primary program to use for any type of type or text layout, and as you've done in your previous exercise, you can perform image making tasks in Photoshop and then transfer them to InDesign if you want to add text. That is a best practice. Now that I've explained to you a little bit about the layers, I'm going to delete this shape layer and come back to it later. On my sketch layer, it's a little hard to see the wall in the background. So I'm going to hit multiply and maybe just turn the opacity down a little bit so that I can see where those wall limitations are. That's good. Now I've basically decided that I want this to be a mural on a hypothetical cafeteria entrance. This is actually a side of a building at Mary Baldwin University's campus, and it may or may not be a cafeteria, but that's what I'm going to propose for the compositional theme of what I'm designing this mural for. Now, as you can see, I've done a key image of these people sitting at tables. I've also got some background texture going on and some geometric elements. I don't love the texture as much now that I see it on the wall. So I want to go ahead and get rid of that so that it doesn't distract me as I work. In order to do that, I'm going to add a mask. And I'm going to increase my brush size. Just get rid of some of that information. It'll be a little bit easier to work with. Again, another quick way you can work is to just grab a selection tool, select everything in one swoop. I'm not worried about it being super perfect. And boom. Okay. That'll be a little easier for me to work with now. And the information will always still be there because I simply applied a mask to that sketch layer. Now I want to go ahead and sketch out the information that's actually here, that key image. So to do that, I'm going to click on a new layer. I'm going to select my paintbrush. I'm going to make sure that it's about the size that I used. And it's going to take me a little bit of time, but I'm going to draw out everything that I see here. And it doesn't really matter what color I use, but I can always go back in and change the color because the information will be in its own layer. That's another best practice. I'm going to go back in underneath this drawing and create some geometric shapes, etc. But I'm going to be doing that in separate layers so that I still have decision-making capabilities going forward. Now, another thing that I want to do before I proceed that'll just make this process a little bit easier. I'm going to up that opacity back to 100, and I'm going to deselect the view for everything but that layer. Now, this has to do with selection, color range selection specifically. If I hit select and then color range, I can click on that brown color and everything that you see in white here is what's going to be selected. Now, the reason that I unclicked the eyeball on these other layers is because if that brown color happened to be in some of the shrubbery, let's say on that original wall picture, it would be picking that up too, and I don't want that. I only want what's brown on this particular layer. So if you increase or decrease the fuzziness, you'll notice some gray appearing. It's basically showing you what it is or isn't going to grab. So you want to be careful. You don't want, you'll notice like a cloud-like form coming up here. You don't want any of that to show up. I want it to be very contrasted, and I'm just going to hit OK. Now, these little marching ants, as they're called, are showing the selection, and I am going to say Edit Copy or Command C Then go back to my new layer. I'm going to take the eyeball off so you can see what's happening, and I'm going to hit Command V or Edit Paste. Just like that, I've created a new layer of pixels that are basically the same as my sketch. And that's one reason that it's helpful to have a sketch ahead of time, because it can help you with the time that you're investing at this stage of your mural design. Now, if I wanted to clean that up a little bit, I could run back over here, do that same color range selection again, make sure that I'm on this layer, and then I can grab my paintbrush. Let's say I wanted that color to be blue. I can just start painting, and everywhere in that selection, it's going to be blue. Now, I actually kind of like it as the deep browns, so I'm going to make it just a little bit more saturated, sort of a coffee brown. And then hit Command D, which is deselect. Now, of course, this isn't going to be a perfect process. For one thing, these edges are not super smooth, and I also have some other data that snuck in, and some parts of this need cleaning up. So if you choose to do it this way, which is a time-saving method, just know that you're going to have to spend some time going back in and perfecting it. I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and then I'll check back in. Okay, I've finished cleaning up my sketch. All my browns are super flat and saturated, and my lines are a little neater. I'm going to go ahead and look at everything that I've got now. And remember that when you're working to do everything in as lossless a way as possible, so I have this new sketch that I've got in its own separate layer, apart from the actual sketch image, and I've named it People to keep myself organized and know what specific information that layer holds. Now I want to add a new layer and put in some of those geometric shapes that I was talking about. Now there are a few different ways you could do this. There is the actual shape tool where I could draw rectangles as I showed you earlier. But there is also another way that you can do it with what's called the pen tool. Now the pen tool is the shining star of Illustrator. Illustrator uses the pen tool to create vector graphics, which we've already talked about at length. However, you can also create vector graphics in Photoshop using the pen tool, and the pen tool is a really spectacular thing. You can do a whole bunch of different stuff with it. You can use a freeform pen tool or a curvature pen tool. You can add and delete anchor points and then convert the point, which I'll explain in just a second. Let me go ahead and take away my sketch, and I'm going to add in another layer real quick. And I am going to fill that layer with white so that you can see very clearly everything that I'm going to be doing with the pen tool. Now, the pen tool can do a lot of different things, and as you begin to use it, you will probably see some of these tutorials pop up. I strongly encourage you to watch those. They're really great resources to explain how the pen tool can work. As I work with the pen tool, I can hold down the Shift key and make sure that I draw in a straight line. I can hold down the Shift key and change my angle so that I know I'm doing everything at a 90-degree angle, or I can just freeform draw in whatever way that I want. Okay? Another way that I can use the pen tool is by holding it down and then moving my finger across my trackpad. What you'll see happening is it's going to create a curved line instead of a straight line. And the more I pull away, the more intense that curve is going to be, and the more I come closer to that filled in square, which is an anchor point, the less curvy it will be. So let's say I stop right here. I mentioned the convert point tool. You can always go back in and re-click on the anchor point and take those handles, as they're called, away.
So now I'm back to where I was. The only issue with using Photoshop to make vectors is that it's not truly a program designed for vectors. That would be Illustrator. So we have the capability, but Photoshop is not necessarily going to be intuitive when it comes to vector elements. So before I proceed, I want to change my people layer to be a little more like how I would ultimately want it to look. I want to be able to see that brick texture through the layer. So I'm going to change the blending mode to vivid light and then proceed with what I'm doing. Go ahead and make a new layer. Now, note that this layer is just a normal layer. It's pixel based, so when we're adding our vectors to it, it doesn't fully know what to do with those vectors yet. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Say I make this shape, and I want to fill that shape as a color. Every single layer of vectors that you make have to be the same color. So if that's the only shape that I want to be in this fuchsia color, let's say, then I would stop there. I would have to hit Layer, New Fill Layer, Solid Color. Now that closed path will be treated as a shape. So even though it's made with vectors, it doesn't necessarily act like a shape until you tell Photoshop, I want this to be a shape. And then it will convert that layer that you were working with, which was a pixel layer, into a shape layer. Now if I decided, oh, I actually do want to add another shape in that color, I could go ahead and do that. But I would have to say Layer, New Fill Layer, Solid Color again, and then hit OK. And it would automatically fill it with that fuchsia color, but now I have two layers with my shapes, and I would just get rid of my first one. Now, let's say I want a different color triangle. I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to make this shape round, just to have a little bit of contrast. Before I go ahead and convert the layer, I'm going to add another shape. Also a round element. And I'm going to click Layer, New Fill Layer, Solid Color, OK. And I can change what color that is at this point. So I'll just select some sort of bluish teal. There we go. And now they are on separate layers and they are different colors. Now of course I don't want it to stay normal, so I can scroll through my blending modes and figure out something else. The most important thing when you're making these blending mode decisions is try to find one that looks like it's actually painted on. It's not going to be perfect, but this exercise is really just to show you how to use Photoshop as a tool to make a mock-up of a mural in case you actually wanted to present a mural design to a client one day. Now, as I'm scrolling through these different blending modes, I don't like any of them for this particular color. So now, to change that color, I can't just click on it. I have to hit Layer, New Fill Layer, Solid Color again, and then change the color. Maybe I'll make something that's like that. And I could just discard the prior layer if I truly didn't want to keep it. Let's see if there's anything better with this layer to be had. That's a little better. Overlay again. And I could call these red shapes. And I could call these purple shapes. Keep in mind that both of these layers are shape layers, which means that you're not going to be able to paint on them. Notice that no signal. You're not going to be able to paint on them because they're not raster layers, and you can only paint or perform most of the Photoshop tools and techniques onto raster/pixel layers. Now, just to overview, if I wanted to move any of these around, I could just go in, make sure that this original move tool is selected, and I can either use my scroll cursors or I can do it by hand. I just don't like how it was overlapping that shadow a little bit, so I'm just inching them down ever so slightly. Let's say I wanted to move just specifically this shape, however. I'd have to go into my selection tools, and I can select by path and then move it around. Or I can select, using my direct selection tool, I can select an individual point by double clicking and then just changing exactly where that lands. So I'm almost done. There are a few logistical things that I need to take care of. First of all, I want to make sure to group my layers and name them according to their groups. First my shapes, then my sketch, and then what I'll call my background. Now I want to make sure that this image is as straight as it can be. So within my background group, I want to be on my within my background group, I want to have my wall selected. Go into the crop function, hit straighten, and this is a perfect time to use the straightening tool because you do have a line going across it, and you can drag this line to be perfectly in line with what you see in the image, and then when you release, it will straighten the photograph. Now, notice that this line now seems perfectly parallel with this other grid line. However, the side of this wall does not seem perfectly parallel with this grid line. So that means that I'm going to have to do something else. When you go into the Edit panel in your menu, you can go down to Transform, and then you have some Scale, Rotate, Skew, Distort, Perspective, and Warp options. I'm going to hit Perspective. That will enable me to change the perspective of this picture ever so slightly and basically just pull that corner out so that that line would be straight. If I hit enter, it will stay that way. I can go back into my crop function, hit my straightening tool, and just see if indeed it is more parallel with that grid. And it does now seem to be exactly parallel. Nothing else in the image seems really skewed. So I'm going to leave it like that. Now my shapes, by making that change, have overlapped that shadow again a little bit. So I'm going to open up my shapes group, click on my red shapes, bring them down ever so slightly, bring my purple shapes down, and there we go. Okay, now looking at my composition, I want to know that it's really finished, that it looks really solidified, and that I like it. I might want to make a change. I might want there to be a background rectangle just to sort of ground the composition a little more so that it's not hanging out in a lot of negative space. I also might want to move this bottom half of the sketch a little farther away from this vent. It looks like it's crowding it a little bit. So I'm going to do those things. First by trying to move my people up a little bit. I don't want to crowd them at the top portion either. So I'm going to scale that sketch layer just a little bit down and center it a little bit more in the wall. Bring it a little bit farther away from that vent. Let's see, that's pretty good. Okay, now I'm going to go into my shapes folder. I'll create a new layer and I'm just going to use the shape tool to create that rectangle and see what I think of it. Up the opacity of that color a little bit more so that you can still see the brick texture, but it's going to be a little bit more punchy. I'm also going to put it underneath my other shapes so that they will be a little bit more vibrant. And I can also put my sketch layer above my shapes to make that more punchy as well. Transform that one more time. Now let's say what I don't love is that I have that blank spot off to the right of the lady. And I want to basically repeat my sketch so that it would be continuing. I can do that by adding another layer, or rather by duplicating this people layer. People copy will be fine. I can then hold down the shift key and drag it. Holding the shift key is merely keeping it oriented at the same position on the y-axis. And then I can add a mask to that layer. And by using my selection tool, I can line it up with the side of the mural. Invert my selection by either hitting Select Inverse or holding down Shift Command I, and then filling all that space with black. Now my mural has repeated itself. That's something that you may like to do, and if you want to, now you have the ability to do it. You can also move layers simultaneously, so I have both of my people selected, and I just want to move them down a little bit. So I'm holding down the shift key, just adjusting those so that they'll be a little bit more centered. There we go. Now let's say I wanted to add one final layer just to basically even out all of the different tones of the composition like we've done before. I'm just going to use my paint bucket tool because that's really easy to use and manipulate. And I personally, just personal preference, like a slightly warmer composition, so I'm going to use something like a burgundy. Just play around again with the blending modes. And I'm not going to leave it as this intense, obviously. I'm going to pull that opacity way down. But that'll give me a slightly warmer composition. It'll make my shadows a little bit warmer. And I can always go in and change the color a little bit if I want. That's pretty good. Now, if I wanted to continue to play around with it, one thing that I could do let me go ahead and rename this first. Fill. I can select all, copy merged, which means it's going to copy everything that I've got, create a new layer, and hit edit, paste. Now, if I remove my vision from everything else, I'm looking at one single layer that has all of the information that I've done to date. I could now go into my adjustments and transform things however I like, with some hue saturation changes, some color balance changes, channel mixer changes, and I do just want to change my color balance a little bit. I want my shadows maybe to be a little bit bluer, my midtones to be a little bit yellower, and this is just general photo adjustment. Once you've got everything exactly as you like it, this can just be a way to change your colors a little bit more. And what I've done is just made the wall a little bit more white, which will make my mural stand out a little bit. And hit OK. And I could name this Final. Great. At this point, you would be finished with your exercise. So you can file, save as a Photoshop document first. So I will name it Mural. Save it to my desktop as a PSD. Okay, you also would want to save it as a JPEG. So just switch to JPEG, call it Mural JPEG, and hit Save. Those two ways that I just saved it, as a PSD and as a JPEG, are the two file formats that you need to email for your exercise submission. And now you've finished exercise 4. Good job.